Well, thank you very much for coming out today. I'm going to speak from down here so I can interact with the screen a bit. I want to thank FPRI. I want to thank Alan. FPRI is really the first institute that gave me an opportunity to talk about Egypt, to talk about foreign policy issues, and I owe a lot of the encouragement to have continued on to Alan and to FPRI. So it's an honor to be back in Philadelphia. We meet at a very interesting time, of course, in the Middle East, but I'm going to step back a bit and I'm going to talk about the changes that have occurred in Egypt over the last 2 years. One of the questions that I get a lot is how is it that this uprising that really started in Tunisia but then overtook Egypt, which seemed to feature very positive, pro-democratic, mostly secularist young people on Facebook and Twitter. How is it that Egypt went from that reality to a reality in which it is now dominated by theocrats, by the Muslim Brotherhood? Was the image that you saw on television incorrect? Was this revolution really led by those young people? What I'm going to show tonight is that actually that image was not incorrect at all. The revolution truly was led and catalyzed by these young people on Facebook and Twitter. But because they were disorganized, because the only thing they were united by was a dislike of Hosni Mubarak, when Mubarak fell, it left it to more organized groups to take over. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Egypt's best organized group, as I'm going to show tonight, had a unique opportunity to take advantage of the revolution, and in fact, they did that. So I want to first step back even further 2 years ago when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork, and I was in Cairo, and I wanted to interview leaders from the Muslim Brotherhood, and I was referred to a man named Mohammed Morsi. And this was coming at a time when President Mubarak was ill. He had gone off to Europe a couple of times for operations, a lot of mysteries surrounding his health. So I asked Mohammed Morsi whether the Muslim Brotherhood would run a presidential candidate if Mubarak died tomorrow. And, well, here's what he said.
So
you don't see the Muslim Brotherhood nominating a presidential candidate?
No.
Really? Why?
No.
Why not?
Because society is not ready. That's our society is not ready yet to really defend its will. We want a society that can defend its will when it's there.
Right.
Our society is not ready yet. We want the society to carry on its responsibilities, and we are part of this society. Any other thing, if we are rushing things, then I don't think that leads to a real stable position.
So let me just start off by stipulating one thing, which is that I don't think he's lying. I don't think he's being coy. I think that he didn't expect that he would be faced with this question in reality in a mere 6 months. I don't think that he expected that Mubarak would go 6 months later. And just to be completely honest with you, neither did I. My dissertation was titled Egypt, Durable Authoritarianism, until the revolution. What's he talking about, though? What is Morsi saying when he says that we're trying to build a society? Let me give you some background on the Muslim Brotherhood. It was founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, who was a school teacher in Ismailia, which is by the Suez Canal. And the way the Muslim Brotherhood's goal is to establish an Islamic state in Egypt, but the way that it pursues that is by trying to Islamize Egyptian society, trying to use social services, use education, use the mosques to make Egyptians more religious and more Islamic as a grassroots strategy for building an Islamic state. That's very, very different from a strategy that says, we're going to run for president and run for the parliament and use power to transform society. The Brotherhood said, we're going to use society to ultimately build towards power. And it was a long-term strategy. It took them 84 years before they ran and won the presidency. So Morsi is telling me in 2010, if Mubarak dies tomorrow, we're not going to run for the presidency because we are not done Islamizing Egyptian society. An Islamic state in Egypt will be most stable once we're done with that work. We're not done with it yet. In addition to this grassroots strategy for Islamizing Egyptian society, the Muslim Brotherhood has had deep hostility towards the West. Some of this was anti-imperialism of the 1920s and 30s, which later became a very virulent anti-Zionism. The Muslim Brotherhood participated in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, well beyond the point at which the Egyptian army had stopped fighting Israel. And that is something that, the Muslim Brotherhood is still very proud of and still carries with it when it talks about, its outlook on Israel and the Middle East. And finally, the Muslim Brotherhood's credo is Allah is our objective, the Quran is our constitution, the Prophet is our leader, jihad is our way, and death for the sake of Allah is the highest of our aspirations. Now, I should clarify something here, that when they say jihad, they do not necessarily mean violent conflict. The way that this credo is interpreted varies considerably among Brotherhood organizations. Now, the Brotherhood was started in Egypt, but now has branches in 72 countries. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood does not typically use violent struggle, jihad. It has at various points in history, but frankly, not recently. That's different from, say, Hamas in Gaza, which is a Brotherhood organization that interprets the jihad clause of this credo as an endorsement of violence. But the point of this credo is, again, that they're trying to establish an Islamic state. What that specifically means is probably something we should address in the Q&A. But anyway, 2 years ago, Mohammed Morsi tells me, no, we're not going to run a presidential candidate. Let me take you to Tahrir Square in June of this year. I was there when Morsi was announced as Egypt's next president. Mohammed Morsi is the next president. That's right, So this was kind of like being in the Bronx when the Yankees win the World Series. I happen to be a Mets fan. I know this is Philadelphia. I'm sorry. No laugh for the Mets fan. Wow. Okay. I should say something about the scenes that preceded this. So clearly, people are very happy. Their candidate, Mohammed Morsi, won. I was in the square that day for a couple of hours prior to this announcement, in part because the announcement took a long time to get out. It was like a very grueling, hot day where they just delayed it forever. But before this, you had Salafists, those are more radical Islamists, marching around the square with shrouds, declaring their willingness to die in fights with security forces if Morsi was not named president. You also had Muslim brothers who had been camped out in the square for 2 weeks, who had been told by their leaders, and I'll show exactly how they were told in a moment, told by their leaders to be prepared to fight if Morsi was not named president. My point is that while it's true that the Brotherhood participated in elections and won their power through elections, had those elections gone the other way, from my perspective, being in the square on that day, they were prepared to fight. So they were not willing to abide by democratic rules in the event that, again, the election didn't go their way. All right, so how'd they do it? I mean, let's get to the opening question. How did they go from essentially the cave being this illegal, secretive organization, deeply repressed by the regime, to capturing Egypt's revolution and now effectively being Egypt's new ruling party? We're going to talk about three things. First of all, they have a committed membership. The way that they get their membership is very different from the way other parties work. Secondly, they have a strong nationwide structure that allows them to move people in a way that's quite similar to how a militia moves people. And I don't mean to imply that they're violent. I just mean to imply that they're very, very organized. And third, they have a controlling, centralized leadership that is quickly distributing top leaders across the new bodies of government that the Brotherhood controls. Let's start off with committed membership. There's this idea out there, there was this idea out there, that if the Brotherhood, the Brotherhood was an opposition organization, they said crazy things, they said radical things, but once they're elected, well, they'll figure it out. They'll moderate, things look different when you're in government versus the opposition. This is actually something that Muslim brothers have said to me. They would say to me things like, previously we were driving a truck, so we didn't have to be so careful, but now, as, controlling the presidency, we're driving an oil tanker. Every turn has to be very, very careful. I think that frankly fails to recognize what it takes to become a Muslim brother. When you became a Democrat or a Republican or a Green Party member or whatever you are, you just signed a form. And that doesn't necessarily imply anything about you. Well, joining the Muslim Brotherhood is not a matter of signing a form. It is, in fact, a 5 to 8 year process that begins at recruitment. The Muslim Brotherhood has specially designated recruiters in just about every mosque and university around the country that look for signs of piety, look to see whether you'd be a good person to fit in the organization. There's this idea out there that Islamist organizations recruit the losers, the loners, the people that can't find a job. Not true of the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood looks for winners. The Brotherhood wants the high school president. The Brotherhood wants the best soccer player. Why? Because the Brotherhood is trying to create a grassroots strategy, a grassroots network for establishing that Islamic State. It wants people who will grow the organization, and that requires winners. That requires attractive people that others will want to follow. Once you're recruited, you become what's called a muhib. A muhib means fan or lover. This is a 6-month to 1 year stage in which you're watched. Do you pray 5 times a day? Do you fast on Ramadan? Do you give charity? Are you a good person? Do you fit in well socially with the organization? Mostly at this stage, you're doing social activities, camping events, soccer events, volunteering. If you pass an exam, you become what's called a mu'ayyid, a supporter. That lasts from 1 to 3 years. And at this stage, you start learning the Brotherhood's curriculum. They have a set curriculum. It includes Quranic memorization. You're taught how to preach at mosques. You're given certain local responsibilities. Throughout this process, you are guided by 3 senior Brotherhood leaders who are watching you. If you pass an exam, you become a muntasib, which means affiliated. That lasts for a year. At this stage, you're called essentially a member in pencil. They could still throw you out if they don't think that you're a good fit, if you don't follow orders, if you're not really that committed to the organization's principles. But at this stage, you also start giving 6 to 8% of your income to the Muslim Brotherhood. I get a lot of questions about how the Brotherhood gets its money. Does it get money from the Gulf? Does it get money from foreign sources? I don't know. But if every Muslim brother is giving 6 to 8% of their income to the organization, and you're talking about maybe 700,000 people, it's pretty clear they have an independent source of wealth. Again, if you pass an exam here, you become what's called a muntazim, an organizer. This lasts for about another 2 years. This is the first time we were able to vote in Brotherhood internal elections. You can have a local leadership position. If you pass this exam, you become an amal, which is a working brother, and you take what's called a bayah, or an oath, to the organization to follow its senior leaders' decisions. Again, this is a 5 to 8 year process during which they're weeding out anyone who might not be committed to the organization's principles and might not be willing to follow the organization's leaders. This is not at all like a standard political party. It is actually much closer to the way a cult works. Moving on. Strong nationwide structure. At the lowest level of the Brotherhood structure is what's called a family, or an usra. You can think of this kind of as a cell. This is a group of 5 to 8 Muslim brothers. They meet weekly for about 3 hours. They discuss Quran, religious texts, the Brotherhood's curriculum, politics. They share their personal lives. this group of people becomes the Muslim Brothers' best friends. If you're a Muslim brother, your best friends, the people that you work most closely with, are in your usra. The usra is a mechanism through which the Brotherhood embeds your social relationships into the organization so that you're less likely to disobey it. Why? Because there's peer pressure. You're less likely to leave it. Why? Because you'll be leaving your best friends. This becomes an important tool for organizing local activities. There's a chief of every family. He's called Naqib al-Usra. And his responsibility is to assign people to recruit, to preach, to run social services, to manage voter kiosks. I'll run through the rest of the national structure quickly because it's very administrative. 6 of 12 families makes up a populace or a sho'aba. A number of those makes up a muntaka or an area. A number of those make up the governorate. This is kind of like a state or a province in Egypt. You have a number of governorates making up a sector. And then at the very top of this pyramid, you have the guidance office, which is comprised of 20 senior Brotherhood leaders. That's the executive body. And then the Shura Committee, the internal Shura Committee, comprised of about 120 Muslim brothers. That's the legislative body. So here's how the Brotherhood works. Here's how it functions as an organization. A decision is discussed and debated and voted on in the Shura Committee and then executed by the guidance office, which just sends the commands down the chain. I'll tell you a story about that. On January 25th, 2011, you had the first demonstrations of Egypt's revolution. The Brotherhood had voted on in the Shura Committee and then passed down through the guidance office that they would not participate in those demonstrations. They discussed this a couple days before. Why didn't they participate in the revolution when it started? Well, 2 reasons. One of which is the Brotherhood at that time was an 83-year-old organization. It wasn't going to follow kids, as they called them, who were on Facebook and Twitter into the square. They're an establishment organization. They have protocol. They don't just follow any movement willy-nilly. The second thing is that the Mubarak regime had told the guidance office that if they participated in the protests, the whole guidance office would be arrested. So the Brotherhood passed a decision down that Muslim brothers should not participate in the demonstrations, and if they did, they should not identify themselves as Muslim brothers or carry the Brotherhood flag. Well, despite not participating, on January 26th, that's day 2 of the revolution, half of the guidance office was arrested anyway, including Mohammed Morsi. So the following night, the Brotherhood decided in its Shura Committee and then executed through the guidance office that it would participate in the revolution. One problem, however, by the night of January 27th, this was a Thursday night, all cell phone and internet communications in Egypt had been shut down, which was a real pleasure for my wife back in Philadelphia trying to reach me. So for the Brotherhood, though, that didn't matter because the Brotherhood has these interpersonal networks where it was able to move people. And the following day was a demonstration called Friday of Rage, where basically Egyptians marched from their mosques after Friday prayers to the central squares. Hundreds of thousands of people participated. They overwhelmed the security forces, defeated the police, attacked police stations, and the Mubarak regime was probably not going to survive after that. The Brotherhood's decision to participate in those demonstrations at that pivotal moment was pivotal for the revolution. Another example, last year I was in Egypt during the parliamentary elections. And at every polling station I visited during the first round, there were Brotherhood voter kiosks. No other party had this. So I would walk up to the young people manning the voter kiosk with, 2 laptops on a bridge table telling people where to vote. And I said, who told you to be here? And they said, we organized it through our USRA, which had been commanded to set up voter kiosks by the guidance office. So this structure is important to understanding how the Brotherhood moves people very efficiently. When it came time to form a political party last year, what the Brotherhood essentially did was it took 3 of its top guidance office members, Mohammed Morsi, Assam al-Aryan, and Saad alKitani, and made them the chairman, vice chairman, and secretary general of the party, respectively. And when it came time to choose parliamentary candidates, the Brotherhood essentially used this structure as a vetting mechanism. So if you wanted to run for parliament, you first discussed it with the head of your family. And then, if he agreed, it was passed up through 5 different levels of Brotherhood administrative leadership until the finalists were passed on to the party, which again was headed by 3 very senior Muslim brothers who then signed off on it. I raise this because there was this myth out there that, okay, the Muslim Brotherhood could moderate. Well, if you're sending up files through this process, guess what? you're probably not going to get moderates. You're getting people who are going to be vetted for their commitment to the Brotherhood's cause by multiple tiers of Brotherhood leadership. Let me bring you up to the present. Today, the Brotherhood will tell you that the Guidance Office, again, that's that central executive body, the Freedom and Justice Party, which controls majorities in the Shura Council and the People's Assembly. The People's Assembly has been disbanded. And the Morsi presidency, that these are essentially three independent things. So just to tell you what this sounds like, I was talking to a senior Guidance Office leader this summer, and I said to him, do you think that President Morsi will meet with Benjamin Netanyahu? And he said, don't ask me. You have to ask President Morsi, because I'm not serving the presidency. And I said to him, well, all right, what if he did meet with Benjamin Netanyahu? And he said, well, very simple. We would launch nationwide labor strikes, and every Egyptian would join us. So kind of gets to the point that these things aren't separate. The Brotherhood has ways of reining in Morsi if he did something like meet with Netanyahu, which is not imaginable for a whole host of reasons. But I found something actually more than that there are substantial overlaps between the Guidance Office, Freedom and Justice Party, and Morsi presidency in that internal Brotherhood Shura Committee. Again, that legislative body comprised of 120 very senior members. So just for example, all of the Guidance Office is a member of the Shura Committee. The four most important members are Khair al-Shatter, Mahmoud Azad, Mahmoud Ghazlan, and Mahmoud Hussein. Within the Morsi presidency, there are at least 3 presidential advisors who are members of that internal Shura Committee. I think there are at least 24. There's no public list of the Shura Committee, but I would estimate there are at least 24 members of the Shura Committee who are also members of the Freedom and Justice Party's People's Assembly delegation. These are 3 of the most important. And the point here is that decisions that are reached by that Shura Committee are binding on all Muslim brothers. And if all these people are meeting in the same room, reaching key decisions, then this Shura Committee is a key driver of the Brotherhood's actions in the Morsi presidency, in Parliament, in the new ruling party, and of course in the Brotherhood itself. And just to show you how interconnected these leaders are beyond this, well, Assam al-Aryan is not only a member of the Morsi presidency advisory team and the Shura Committee, he's also a People's Assembly leader on the Freedom and Justice Party. These 2 guys are also members of the Guidance Office. These 3 are also former Guidance Office members in new positions. But there was one exception to this theory that I've explained here, which was the Speaker of the Shura Council. That's kind of like Egypt's House of Lords. And he is actually not a member of that internal Shura Committee. So when I'm doing my research this summer, I'm saying to myself, well, is my theory wrong, right? Or is the Shura Committee, Shura Council not that important, so they didn't need to put one of their top leaders in that position? So I went to interview him. And what did I find? Well, first of all, he was university colleagues with 2 of the top Guidance Office members. One other thing, he was university colleagues and roommates with Mohammed Morsi. Something else, his son married Mohammed Morsi's daughter. And just to show you kind of how intermingled and interconnected this all is, Mahmoud Ghazlan, the Brotherhood spokesman, married Khair al-Shatter's sister. Mahmoud Azad, a top Brotherhood leader, married the former Supreme Qaid's daughter. This is an organization, in other words, that keeps it within the family, literally. Moving on. What I'm basically arguing here is that the Brotherhood and Freedom and Justice Party's political strategy is centralized in that internal Shura Committee. And this is no longer even a guess. This is something that the Brotherhood is increasingly public about. So, for example, when the Freedom and Justice Party decided how many seats to run for in Parliament, it didn't reach that decision on its own. It reached it in consultation with the Brotherhood Shura Committee. When it decided to run a presidential candidate, that was not a decision that the party reached. It was reached in the Brotherhood's internal Shura Committee. When Morsi wanted to choose governors of Egypt as president, he consulted with the Brotherhood's internal Shura Committee. The Brotherhood's internal Shura Committee, a secretive body, plays an important role in making political decisions for Egypt now that the Brotherhood has a president. By the way, this is me with Saad alKitani, the former Speaker of Parliament, who's now the chairman of the Brotherhood's political party, at the Brotherhood's internal Shura Committee meeting. He was reportedly not there, and I showed this photo to someone claiming he wasn't there to show that he was, in fact, there. Okay, not only that, the Brotherhood, the Freedom and Justice Party, and Morsi will coordinate to use the Brotherhood's mobilizing networks on behalf of their own activities. So, for example, in the week before Morsi was named president, the Brotherhood used that organizational pyramid that I showed to get people into the square. And it wasn't just a matter of telling people, hey, go sit in the square until he's president. People were seated by administrative district. How do I know? Because I walked up to some guy who looked like he was in charge. And I said to him, excuse me, are you the leader of your local Brotherhood family? And he said, no, I'm the leader of my Sha'aba. That's that second tier of administrative leadership that has about 75 to 90 Muslim brothers. And he said to me, and I said, okay, that's interesting. I don't see 75 to 90 people here. He says, well, that's because, it's a Sunday. Many of us go home. We all have to be here on Friday. We have kids, so we coordinate amongst ourselves. And I said to him, well, how do you know what to do when you're in the square? And he said, well, very, very simple. And he takes out of his pocket a communique on Brotherhood stationery. And it has orders of what the brothers are supposed to do in the square. What time they're supposed to pray. They want everyone praying at the same time. To keep their areas clean. To raise their spirit levels, which is a certain type of Brotherhood ideological practice. And he got that memo twice daily from a central figure in the square who communicates directly with the guidance office. So this is very, very organized. Another example. When Morsi became president, he announced a 100-day plan where he would accomplish 5 things. Fix Cairo's traffic. Anyone been to Cairo, by the way? You're not going to fix the traffic in 100 days, right? You got to build highways, right? Fix the traffic, pick up the trash, deal with the security problems, deal with food shortages, and deal with gas shortages. All right, forget that he couldn't accomplish this in 100 days. That's obvious. Why did he think he could? Very simple, because they commanded Brotherhood youth cadres to direct traffic, provide security, hand out food, clean up the streets. So the Brotherhood is going to try, it might not work, but will try to circumvent state institutions by mobilizing its people through that structure that I laid out. And finally, the Muslim Brotherhood, because it's so organizationally capable, is unlikely to moderate. I mean, if you can move people that quickly, if you're the only organized political force, you're probably going to win. And if you're going to keep winning, why would you concede anything ideologically? You wouldn't. And that's really what moderation means, right? Conceding something ideologically. So long as the Brotherhood is likely to be Egypt's only organized political force, there's simply no incentive for it to moderate. And there's another reason why it won't moderate, if we mean moderate in terms of move towards the center, which is that its strongest opponents are the Salafists. Now, the Brotherhood's approach to Sharia, which are kind of the principles of Islamic law, is interpretive. That's what it says, that it interprets the Sharia with an eye towards social benefits. This is a much longer discussion, probably a series of lectures, but suffice it to say that they are willing to interpret the text of the Sharia. By contrast, Salafists are textual literalists, and they emphasize the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. I'll give you some kind of very basic examples. Salafists will grow a long beard and no mustache or a very short mustache because that's what the Prophet Muhammad did. Many of them don't like to wear suits because they consider suits an innovation. Prophet Muhammad wore sort of like a tunic, so that's what they'll wear. Not all of them, but many of them. Muslim brothers will brush their teeth using a toothbrush like you and I, hopefully, right? Salafists, many of them will brush their teeth using sticks because that's what the Prophet Muhammad did. These are kind of like very basic examples. But that means that they're further to the theocratic right than the Brotherhood. More importantly, they're decentralized, whereas the Brotherhood is one thing, one organization that can move all its people, that vets its people for their commitments to that organization's organization and principles. The Salafists are actually divided among a host of different parties and movements and political figures. That's because being a Salafist is not tied to an organization. Being a Salafist is simply about interpreting the text literally, but you're free to follow any number of thousands of Salafist sheikhs. So there's a lot more independence built into Salafism. That means that they're a lot harder to mobilize in a coherent way. And moreover, it's easier to become a Salafist. You know, becoming a brother, as I told you, is a 5 to 8 year process. Salafists become Salafists by declaring themselves a multazim, someone who's committed to living according to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. That's an instantaneous decision, and you grow a beard and you start doing some very restrictive things, in your personal life. However, the point is that it's a lot easier to become one, and in this new Egypt, it actually might be more attractive. Because think of yourself as a young Islamist, right? If you have a choice as a young Islamist now to either join the Muslim Brotherhood, which will take 5 to 8 years, and force you to follow a very senior leadership, or you can become a multazim, which takes 5 minutes, and you could follow any Salafist sheikh you want, well, it's pretty obvious which is more attractive. And the fact that the Brotherhood and Salafists will battle over ideas and recruitment, the fact that these are going to be the two primary competing forces in Egyptian politics means that rather than being pulled towards the center, the Brotherhood will probably be pulled more towards the theocratic right. It will have to protect its rightward theocratic flank from the Salafists, who will challenge them on recruitment and challenge them for who is the better Islamist. Policy points. All right, what does this all mean for the United States? My first point is probably a little bit counterintuitive. The key for U.S. policy is the Sinai. I didn't talk about the Sinai, so what am I talking about now? If what we have in Egypt now is the emergence of two theocratic organizations, one of which is likely to win reliably for a long time, both of which are quite hostile towards U.S. interests, our goal should be to reduce the incidence of a crisis, to reduce the likelihood of a crisis. That crisis in America, regarding American interests, is most likely to start in the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula is an unstable peninsula in which 30 Bedouin tribes are effectively fighting each other for land and control, some of which are co-opted by terrorist organizations. And the concern is what happens if instability in the Sinai spills over into Israel and creates a crisis between Israel and Egypt. So let me kind of game this out for you, right? Imagine a scenario in which terrorists from the Sinai Peninsula strike Israel. Israel responds, shoots over the border into Egypt, and accidentally kills Egyptians. We saw this play out in August 2011 when the military was still in charge. And it culminated in mass protests and an attack on the Israeli embassy, which almost sunk the Camp David Accords. The Egyptian attackers and Israeli diplomats in that embassy were within one door of each other, and had any of them died, there is almost no question that relations between the two countries and the peace treaty would have been in deep, deep danger. So from our perspective, what we need to do to prevent a reemergence of that kind of crisis now under the Brotherhood's leadership is to do everything we can to, first of all, find an economic and security situation economic and security solution for the Sinai in the long run, but in the short run, create the channels between the Muslim Brotherhood and Israel, quiet channels that would allow them to diffuse a crisis. Because I've asked Muslim Brotherhood leaders, what happens if this kind of crisis emerged under your watch? When it emerged under the military's watch, the military dialed things down after a very tricky period. Would you dial things down? And brothers repeatedly have said to me, no, we would not. The Muslim Brotherhood has made it clear to me that their end goal is to do away with this treaty that they have long opposed, and I suspect that they might use this kind of crisis as an excuse to find an out from that treaty. Secondly, we have to link our military and economic aid to performance on key American interests. One of those interests is, of course, the treaty, but we have other interests. Access to the Suez Canal, overflight rights, cooperation on counterterrorism, pluralism. Military aid should be used for these strategic elements, the elements that the military will be primarily responsible for handling. Counterterrorism, Suez Canal access, preventing weapons from getting into Gaza, for example. But on the economic side, we should be using not only economic aid, but our influence in the IMF, where Egypt is looking for a $4.8 billion loan to make sure that Morsi does and says responsible things. And he hasn't done that. For example, when the U.S. Embassy was attacked in September, Morsi waited 2 days before saying anything at all. and initially seemed to blame the attack on some video online until President Obama read him the Riot Act. And it was only then that he came out and denounced it. We need to use our aid to make sure that he understands that that aid is contingent on him being a partner. Finally, we need to, I think, change the way we talk about Egypt. You know, too frequently, the administration has referred to the Brotherhood as democratic. Well, first of all, the Brotherhood's not democratic, it's theocratic. It wants to establish a religious state in Egypt. Not only that, had the election gone another way, I'm convinced from having been in the square, the Brotherhood would have used violence to reject the outcome. And moreover, when we call the Brotherhood democratic, we signal to non-Islamist forces in Egypt that we have thrown our support behind the Brotherhood. Now, frankly, I don't think we have. But the suspicion in Egypt is that we are trying to replace a strong dictator with a strong organization. And we need to do everything we can to make sure that people know that we are neutral within the sphere of domestic Egyptian politics. Secondly, we need to speak up more for minority rights. Christians in Egypt feel neglected. There have been a series of church attacks since last year's revolution. There was a military assault on a Coptic protest last year in which about 25 people were run over by tanks, and the administration didn't say anything. We need to speak out, because when we fail to speak out, again, that's taken as a sign that we've thrown our weight behind the Islamists. And that's why when Hillary Clinton went to Egypt in July, she was met by protests not by Islamists, but by Christians and secularists who felt that the United States had sold them out. These are our friends in a country in which we unfortunately do not have many friends. We need to do what we can to protect that friendship. And finally, we need to talk about Camp David not as an American interest exclusively, but as an Egyptian interest. And I'm going to close here with a story. I was with a senior Brotherhood leader last year. And at the time, the Brotherhood was saying it was going to put the Camp David Accords to a referendum. Why? Because if you vote down the Accords, they didn't do away with them. So I said to him at the end of my interview, when you say you're going to put the Accords to a referendum, you're doing something very dangerous. And he said, why? A referendum is democracy. He said, why? I said, well, because you're signaling that you want to end a peace treaty that's prevented war between you and a much stronger country to your northeast for the past 30 years. He said, well, a referendum is democracy. And I said, no. Democracy is electing you. What you decide to do is what you decide to do. Are you going to put your tax policy to a referendum? He said, no, that's different. I said, why is that different? People pay a quarter of their income to taxes. You think they care more about some treaty they don't feel any day of the week to taxes that they pay every year? He started ranting about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I said to him, listen, you and I can agree to disagree on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we should not disagree on the importance of keeping a peace treaty that prevented war between you and that much stronger country to your northeast for the last 30-plus years. Let me ask you something. Do you want Egyptians to die? And he said, no. And I said, then you'll keep the treaty. Let me tell you something else. If you don't keep the treaty, I'll feel very bad. I got a lot of friends in Egypt. I like Egypt. I think it's a great place. But I'll be 6,000 miles away. This is on you. It's on you and what kind of country you want to lead. And I think that's the message that needs to come out of Washington, that this is on them, that power means responsibility. I'm going to close with what I like to call fun facts. These are not that fun, to be very honest with you. These are tidbits that I learned on my summer month-long trip to Egypt. Number 3, Rafat Mohammed Tahtawi was rumored to be Egypt's next foreign minister. This is the former Egyptian ambassador to Iran and Libya. He's a strong proponent of strengthened Iranian and Egyptian ties, a strong opponent of the peace treaty with Israel. The fact that he was rumored to be the next foreign minister, which is something I heard from multiple governments, by the way, including Egypt's, of course, shows where the Brotherhood kind of intends to take Egypt. But I suspect the military prevented this, and he's now Morsi's chief of staff. Not too shabby. Number 2, 3 top Muslim brothers were recruited to the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, including Morsi himself. Morsi, of course, is now president of Egypt. Mohammed Ali Bishar is a guidance office member, as well as the new governor of Minafia. And Mahmoud Hussein is the Brotherhood Secretary General. Actually, he's the one who told me this. And Mahmoud Hussein, when he was a PhD student at I believe, the University of Iowa City, was the president of MAYA, the Muslim American Youth Association. And while he was getting to know these guys in the United States, they were also very friendly with Hamas's number 2, Musa Abu Marzouk, who was also based in the United States, involved in these Brotherhood networks at that time. And the number 1 fun fact that I unearthed during my summer trip, Hamas's point of contact in the Muslim Brotherhood prior to him being president was Mohammed Morsi. So what we have here is an organization that is well organized, that vets its members for their commitment to the cause, and a leader who has a long-standing relationship institutionally and personally with Hamas. So I just want you to keep that in mind, because there's this idea out there that what we have is an Arab Spring. And in fact, that Arab Spring has been overtaken by Islamists who do not hold the same ideals, the same values, the same optimism as the young people who I think inspired many of us 2 years ago. Thank you very much.
My question to you, thank you very much for that incredible presentation. My question to you is, number one, why were the Muslim brothers so forthcoming in response to your questions? That I would have thought, just from what I've read, that they would have been more guarded. And number two, did you pose the questions in English or Arabic?
Great questions. You know, I think that when I ask them these questions, remember, I'm asking mostly about kind of nitty-gritty organizational details. I don't think they expect these questions. I think that you know, they expect questions on their stance on Israel and women and will they ban bikinis and alcohol and that sort of thing. So a lot of my early information on these structural details I got from interviewing young and former Muslim brothers. And what I then did with that was then finally work my way up to the top leaders. And I've really interviewed most of the top leaders to confirm a lot of those details. So I think in part it's surprise because they really don't think that, that Americans know these things. And in part it's that, I mean, I kind of come with the information and more than anything seek confirmation, which they give, and they're surprised that I know it. You know, most of my interviews are conducted in Arabic. I admit that I use an interpreter because, you know, I read Arabic. My Arabic's okay, but for this kind of research, it's got to be so detailed and so perfect that I don't want to take any chances.
Would you mind repeating the last sentence of the credo for the Muslim Brotherhood?
Oh God, putting me on the spot.
You had a slide in the beginning.
Yeah, I think it's death in the service of Allah is our highest aspiration, is among our highest aspirations.
So what I'm interested in is what does it mean to the free world if we, as listeners of something like that, continue to ignore the precise, unequivocal meaning of each word and then the entire sentence? Mm-hmm. Are we to say that that's not sincere?
I didn't say they weren't sincere.
No, not you. Yeah. I mean, I'm asking, that is something I've heard in many places, and yet I don't have the sense that people actually believe they mean that.
I think that for certain they mean it in the theoretical sense. Look, I mean, I used to ask Muslim brothers the following question. Do you aspire to die as a martyr in Palestine? Why did I ask them that? I asked them that because actually the first Muslim brother I ever interviewed was a young person. He was 20 years old, and he had told me that he'd gone to Gaza when there was an opening in the Rafah crossing. And he gave me a lot of kind of interesting details, but he told me, and I'll never forget this, that he hoped an Israeli missile would hit him so that he could die as a martyr in Palestine because that was his higher aspiration. So I've asked a lot of Brotherhood leaders and young brothers if this is what they too aspire to. Because at the time, it really shook me. I mean, this is a 20-year-old English-speaking smart guy saying he wants to die at an Israeli missile attack. And for the most part, the answers that I've gotten are like, yeah, but not now, or not really, or like a laugh, which is to say that I think the dying in the service of Allah is my highest aspiration is more than anything theoretical. And I think that the goal of U.S. policy has to be keeping it theoretical, to use the right policy tools so that the Brotherhood is not tempted to act on the most rigid interpretation of its own ideology. And I think we can do that, by the way. I mean, one thing that I think this latest conflict in Gaza has demonstrated is that even though the Brotherhood's first impulse is to be hostile towards Israel, is to make statements denouncing Israel, to send their prime minister, during which time Israel doesn't fire anything, but Hamas fires an additional 50 rockets into Israel, including at Jerusalem. Despite these things, I'm not saying they're not significant, the Brotherhood's ultimate impulse was to push for a ceasefire. Because the Brotherhood, despite its ideology, is given credit, and I think rightfully so, for living in the real world. And our goal has to be keeping them in the real world by making sure that there are very clear and clearly stated consequences for, for more ideologically inclined action.
You made a very strong point of the tie of Morsi to Hamas. Mm-hmm. And Hamas's most characteristic statement is, you love life, we love death, and we will win. That's death twice. I think they're connected.
They are, but they are connected. I mean, there's no.
Not pretense.
Yeah.
Yeah, a comment and a question. I attended the Herzliya conference in Israel 2010 and 2011. The 2011 one was right after the Arab Spring was emerging, particularly in Tahrir Square. There was a big division of opinion at that time. Americans, journalists and scholars, and some Europeans were very hopeful about it. The Israelis, I would say almost to a man, were very pessimistic about it. Question, this issue of extremism. You made a point of saying that the Salafists represent a kind of limit that can draw the Muslims. Is that peculiar to Egypt, or do you see this as something that's going to influence the whole Muslim world? I actually have a personal recollection of speaking to a Pakistani woman who used to be associated with FPRI and offending her. This was years ago. I'm talking about 15 years ago at least, by saying that my fear was that it was the extreme element in Islam that was going to carry the day.
I think that's, well, first of all, to your first question, the competition between the Brotherhood and the Salafists is not unique to Egypt. Actually, it's something that we're seeing in Tunisia. It's something that we're certainly seeing in Syria right now. It's something that we're seeing in the Palestinian territories, where Hamas really is coming under attack from much more radical organizations, which contributed to the current conflict in a certain sense. And I think that what this says to me is that the path of the Middle East is not really towards democracy, but towards competitive theocracy, in which two very distinctive competing visions of what it means to have an Islamic state duke it out. And I see a long-term advantage to the Salafists for two reasons, one of which is I just think, in the present day and age, it's much more compelling to join an organization that's easier to join and doesn't require that you follow any certain individual. You can choose your own sheikh, right? And the second reason is, and I didn't really get to address this, in a real sense, the Salafists have an ethos, whereas the Brotherhood does not. I'll just give you an example of that. If you ask Muslim brothers now, okay, you've worked for 84 years for this moment, for executive power. You have it. You can now establish an Islamic state. What are you going to do? What policy is going to change tomorrow from what it was yesterday? They don't have an answer. And I don't think they're being coy. I think that they actually really haven't thought it through. I think they've been so focused on this societal work and on trying to get power that they haven't really come up with an answer. So they'll say general things, like we're going to have justice and freedom and less corruption. But that's not a policy. You ask a Salafist, we're going to have all women wear hijab, preferably face covering. We're going to ban alcohol. We're going to establish Islamic banks to get rid of interest-based banking. They have an answer. Now, obviously, it's not an answer that I like, but it's an answer. And I think that ideologically, their arguments are going to be more compelling. But I hope I'm wrong. As to the question on, you had a second question.
The extremism, the tendency to that extremism is going to carry the day.
Look, the only antidote to extremism will be the emergence of a viable, cohesive, non-Islamist alternative in Egypt. And I can't tell you for certain that doesn't exist, because we really don't have enough data on the Egyptian electorate. We have two elections, basically. A parliamentary election in which Islamists got 75% of the votes, and a presidential election in the second round of which the Brotherhood only got 51%. The ex-Mubarak candidate actually got over 48%. So that would suggest there is a non-Islamist population there, but they're deeply divided. They could maybe mobilize around one candidate in a two-candidate race, but in a multi-candidate race, you have leftists, liberals, Nasserists, Arab socialists, communists, and even within those subsets, multiple parties because of competing egos. So that would be the best antidote if these non-Islamists can get their act together. But again, how do you reconcile liberalism and communism? Very hard.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you very much for the superb presentation. What happened to the young people in Tahrir Square? I have so many questions. And what happened, is there now a free press or not? Mm-hmm. And do you think the Muslim Brotherhood now is entrenched, that it's one vote, one man, one time only, or not? Thank you.
As for the young people who were in Tahrir, needless to say that they're depressed. I mean, these were people who were hailed as champions of democracy, as having brought down a dictator, really became media stars, even in their own country and to some extent globally, and now have no power, have no say, are not really that influential. And the question is, well, will they lead a second revolution? And this has been the dog that hasn't barked. I mean, people keep talking about this, oh, there's going to be a second revolution on Friday. Well, it hasn't happened. The key thing that could change that is kind of a question of how deep the economic suffering goes. Because then there's this idea out there, well, that next uprising against the Brotherhood will happen when the economy dips even further in Egypt. But again, it's the dog that hasn't barked. But these young people, really feel defeated. I can't say that there's anything they could have done differently, because the bottom line is that they were united about one thing, bringing down the regime. They disagree on all other issues. The Brotherhood is different. The Brotherhood can mobilize. The Brotherhood is one coherent thing, and that's what wins elections in disorganized societies. Do I think the Brotherhood will hold the second election? I actually think they will. Why? Because they're likely to win the election. So why not hold it? Why not use that to legitimate, your power? I do think that the Brotherhood will continue to spread its top leaders across these bodies of government, maybe appointing more ministers, maybe appointing more governors. I think there's going to be a drawn-out process, but no question the Brotherhood is going to do everything it can to put its people inside as many organizations of government as possible. The key question is, can they penetrate the military and security forces? I don't have an answer for that. I just think that if you're watching this, it's something to watch for. Your other question?
Freedom of press.
Freedom of press. Freedom of press has remained restrictive in the sense that the Brotherhood has fired editors who have criticized it, has also done a lot to appoint its own people to state editors, has moved against independent press outlets that have criticized it. However, and I think this is important, it's not as restrictive as it was under Mubarak. I mean, there is criticism of Morsi out in public that would have never been tolerated under Mubarak. And I think that that's an interesting thing. So are they Democrats? No. Are they liberals? No. But I can't say that it hasn't improved. It has in a certain respect.
What's your opinion on the outcome and the result among Morsi, Netanyahu, and Mrs. Clinton on the ceasefire with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Hamas and Israeli?
I mean, it's a developing story. So, standing up here, I'm actually not totally sure where it's at. When I got up here, there had not yet been a ceasefire. But one of the things that I think will really hamper Egypt's ability to play a central role between the Israelis and Palestinians is that Morsi and the Brotherhood still refuse to meet and deal with Israelis. They've really outsourced this to their security and intelligence professionals and their diplomatic professionals. Now, in the short run, that's been good enough. But I don't think that's sustainable in the event that you have a real crisis. What's interesting is that this Gaza war has not yet created that crisis. I think that Morsi doesn't want that crisis right now for a number of reasons. Egypt is facing a constitutional crisis. You had mass protests yesterday in which one Egyptian died, having to do with the one-year anniversary of an episode from last year. This is all domestic stuff. You have a sinking economy. Yesterday, Morsi's sister died. So you have a whole list of reasons why right now is a very inconvenient time for Morsi and the Brotherhood to use this as an excuse to advance what their real agenda is vis-a-vis Israel. But the fact is that he has not used this to kind of establish any kind of relationship with Israel. And my concern is that that creates real instability in the treaty moving forward.
I'd like to ask you about an Arab word that's had a long history in the Muslim world, Takea.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Takea.
Sure.
How does Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood see the use and the meaning of Takea in their communications with you and with others?
So Takea basically means that you kind of hide your true intentions. You lie to outsiders especially to advance like a radical agenda. I actually haven't asked Muslim brothers about that in particular. I mean, deceit, right. But the context, yeah.
You feign this way, but you're really
right,
that way.
Right. That's right. Thank you. Deceit in this case, I mean, in the Islamist context, to the West or to other Egyptians.
To the non-believers.
To non-believers. Look, I haven't asked them about Takea. I mean, my conversation with them really are about less ideological things for the most part. I mean, obviously I address the issue of Israel and the treaty and strategic concerns and economic ideas, but I really focus my conversations mostly on these internal details. And because there's kind of like no pre-prepared talking point on this, I found them very honest with me on these things.
Final question here.
So this might be a little bit, you might have addressed this earlier, or it might not be a part of your discussion, but you hear a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood and their base doctrine and how they kind of follow the communistic view of the West and kind of destruction within projection of power. Do you hold a stock into that, or is that like a theory that the Muslim Brotherhood is still trying to approach, is utilizing its own power through monetary influence within the United States to influence a greater agenda, or do you kind of just?
I mean, I don't buy into that for the simple reason that while the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and America and Jordan and in all the 72 countries in which they exist, and by the way, that's something that the Muslim Brotherhood is proud of because it means that they're an international organization. They're very consistent in their principles, but really their ability to act on them varies very considerably. So in Egypt, they have executive power. In Syria, they dominate the Syrian National Council. In Jordan, they're now emerging as a major opposition to the king. Obviously, they always were in the opposition, but now they've actually called for him to step down as of a couple of days ago, right? In the United States, their ability to affect political change is minor because they're a small organization. So it's not something that I'm particularly concerned about. Obviously, there have been cases of Brotherhood-affiliated groups raising money for terrorist organizations, which the Justice Department, Treasury have rightfully pursued. But I don't see them as capable of really affecting change from within. So it's not something that I'm particularly concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Was that not a remarkable presentation? Thank you very much, Eric Trager. I have good news for Eric. You don't have to change your dissertation because judging by what you just said, authoritarianism is durable in Egypt. So nothing to revise. Let me thank you all for coming. If you're interested in becoming a member, if you're not now a member, there is a membership form down at the front desk where you arrived. And Dr. Templeton did bring along some handouts at the back of the room about Takea, the question which he raised. So let me thank you all for joining us and hope to see you next time, December 4th, on Turkey.